This is the Mojo Story. I am Barkha Dutt. Today is the 23rd of June, and that date is a date that should be significant to two countries, India and Canada. It was on this day that the terror unfolded on board Air India 182 that was headed from Toronto to Delhi via Montreal. It was on this flight that two suitcase bombs exploded, killing all 329 on board. Among those who were killed were 82 children. Now, a subject of new book, Blood for Blood, which looks at 50 years of what the author is calling the Global Khalistan Project. Terry Milewski has authored this book. He's been following the Sikh extremist terror movement for many, many years, since that Kanishka bombing. And the 23rd of June, we thought, is the apt anniversary to actually be in conversation with the author himself, joining us now live from Canada. Let's go across to Terry Milewski, as I said, who has authored this book on the anniversary of the horrific Kanishka bombing. Terry, welcome to this conversation. I wish we were talking in better times, but the book, against the backdrop of this anniversary, really brings home a chilling message. And when one goes through your book, it is this, that this project, what you call the Global Khalistani Project, is not over yet. In India, many people tend to look at Khalistan and everything that happened, in the horrible, horrific 80s as a thing of the past. But for a journalist who's been following this now over many decades, I think you want the global audience to understand that this is not a project on which the finished sign can be hung up just yet.
I agree with you completely. Good evening to you and your audience. I think you've hit the nail on the head in this sense that for many Indians, this is just a bad memory. The Khalistan movement, it was terrible times, notably in Punjab, of course, for about 10, 12 years in the 80s and early 90s. Then it fizzled out 30 years ago, 25 years ago, fizzled out. But it has not fizzled out in the diaspora. It has not fizzled out in Canada. In Canada today, you would never know that it had fizzled out. You can go to a major Gurdwara in Surrey, BC, that's the second largest city after Vancouver, in British Columbia on Canada's west coast, and see a huge life-size portrait on the outside of the Gurdwara showing a heroic pose of Talvinder Singh Parmar, the mastermind, the architect of the Air India bombing, Canada's worst ever terrorist attack. And he is revered as a hero by people at that Gurdwara. And there are similar pictures more discreetly displayed elsewhere. The one you're looking on your screen right now, that was in a Vaisakhi parade float. This is a surveillance picture. At the time of the bombing years ago in 1985, that was taken just right after it with his partner, Arjun Singh Bagri. So I caution anyone who thinks it's over. This is a book about the past. I hope it is, but I'm not sure of that.
In the past, you have also referred to the relationship between Khalistanis and Pakistan being like that of an abusive marriage. You've spoken about how Khalistan or those who still believe in it do not know where else to turn. And I'll come to the Pakistan question in just a moment. But for Canada, as you said, this is not yet a thing of the past. Why is it still able to thrive? And I ask this in particular because it is an irritant between India and Canada. We saw when Trudeau, for example, came to India, he ended up having an unsavory Khalistani guest on his dinner list, and it created a huge diplomatic storm.
Yes, that's true. And it was an extremely embarrassing event. This was a man, as you'll recall, who actually was convicted of attempted murder. He tried to assassinate a cabinet minister from Punjab in 1986 on Vancouver Island. He shot him twice. I was lucky that the man survived. Malkiat Singh Sidhu, he was later assassinated 5 years later, by the way. And he ended up on the guest list for fancy receptions, not one, but two, one in Mumbai, one in New Delhi, for the visiting Prime Minister Trudeau. This was in 2018. And of course, this blew up. Of course, it was going to be a scandal. The question is, why did the Prime Minister and his aides not realize that it would be a scandal? I mean, isn't that kind of obvious if you have a convicted terrorist, an attempted murderer on the guest list for a diplomatic reception, posing with the prime minister's wife for selfies. It's a little much, but they didn't see that coming because they have over many years normalized the entree, if you will, the entry of Khalistani supporters, Parmar fans, if you will, the fans of Talvinder Parmar, into normal politics in Canada. So that is it's an ongoing problem. That's definitely not over.
How did that get to be so normalized? Because in India, while there are of course strains of extremism in any community, the Sikhs are actually seen as a community that performs great service. Even during this pandemic, at this point, it is gurdwaras that have led the way in, for example, providing oxygen langars. That's what they're called.
Yeah.
Sikhs have often been, the Sikhism is built on the principle of seva, which is service to the community. So how did there come to be this level of tolerance, this level of acceptance, this level of normalization for this in Canada?
Well, I would say first that it's very much the same in Canada. The Sikh community in general has an excellent reputation, hardworking professionals. They do a great deal of community service, and they still have an excellent reputation. But there is this small minority. That's what we're talking about, not the Sikh community in general. This small minority that knows how to maximize their political influence. They are there to lick envelopes and knock on doors at election time. Politicians, and I'm talking about all parties, this isn't liberal or conservative or whatever. All parties like it when they get free volunteers to help them at election time, and they don't look too carefully at who they are. When they go to the Vaisakhi parade and they see these floats go by with portraits of bloodthirsty Sikh martyrs carrying AK-47s, they look the other way because, if they make a fuss, they could be unelected next time around. That's the key to this, the fact that this small minority, they have a fiery determination, they are extremely committed, and unlike the rest of the Sikh community, which is busy like the rest of us, raising families and getting to work on time, this small minority has a special agenda, and they know that their lifeline is politics.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about the book that we're here to talk about, right? When you say 50 years of the Global Khalistani Project, I was struck by the word global. Obviously, what you're talking about is that there are multiple nations involved. India, of course, because India was the origin, and the home originally for the families of many of these. But there's also Pakistan involved. There's also Canada involved. I think India would argue that there is also groups that seek refuge in London, in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
What would you point to, and what did your research lead you to in the writing of this book?
Well, one thing is extremely obvious. It's almost too obvious to mention, but this is the key. That is that the diaspora, the Sikhs, non-resident Sikhs all over the world, they are self-selected. They decided they did not want to live in India. They wanted to live in somewhere else. Second, many of those people, they didn't want to particularly to live, the hardliners, they didn't want to live in London or Toronto either. They wanted to live in an independent state. And they also tended to live, if I may say, a little bit in the past. That is to say, when they left, maybe they left in 1984, there were massacres in India at that time. Maybe that's how they remember it. And plus, many of them were banned from visiting India. So they couldn't go to India, see their families, and find out that, things have changed in India. So, stuck in the past, self-selected for discontent with India, that meant that this small minority, it might stay small, but it stayed.
Yeah, I think my question to you would be this, that one, when you talk about the massacres of the 80s, I mean, there would be Indians who would, of course, contest that narrative. They would say what happened after the assassination of Indira Gandhi was, of course, terrible. But she was trying to crack down on terrorism. Of course, it could be argued that initially her policies, helped strengthen those terrorists, but eventually she stormed the Golden Temple, she flushed it out of terrorists, and of course the anti-Sikh riots that followed were a blot in terms of justice. Now, talking about justice, do you believe justice has been delivered for the victims of the Kanishka bombing? Because even Parmar, the inquiry that was held in Canada did find him guilty. But many people continue to believe that the Canadian different governments did not crack down in the way that they should have.
Those people are right. And I think this is the one thing that I dig into fairly deeply in my book. It's not a pretty picture, I must confess. And your question is quite embarrassing for a Canadian, because it forces me to admit that, no, we did a lousy job of rendering justice to the families of the Air India victims, among others. But we didn't know, and let's blame the media here too. I include the media. People like me had a great time blaming the police for failing to prevent the bombing, blaming the government for tolerating extremism. But we didn't do so well at criticizing ourselves for the poor job we did of conveying to the general public, not just in Canada, but around the world, the danger of the threat and the fiasco that was the police investigation and the trial of those involved. No, the answer to your question is unequivocally, we did not render justice, except in one case. A foot soldier, the man who built the bomb. He was a mechanic. They said, "Can you build a couple of bombs?" They didn't even seem to. He didn't even seem to know what they were for, although obviously they were deadly weapons. He knew that. He went to jail. No, he wouldn't open his mouth. He wouldn't sell out his comrades, and he's the only one convicted to this day. The rest, the investigation was, I must say, and I looked at this carefully, and I'm choosing my words with care. The investigation was an absolute fiasco. Can you imagine? I think Indians have heard about this, but whatever they've heard, it's actually worse. The wiretaps, they had wiretaps of the suspects for 3 months before the bombing and erased them. They erased the wiretaps.
Why would they erase the wire? Why?
Because, well, people think that, oh, it's a conspiracy. They were a part of the plot. There was a cover-up, blah, blah, blah. No, they were simply dumb bureaucrats. They had a procedure. The procedure said if you can't prove a crime, you have to trash the wiretaps. Otherwise, you're invading the privacy of Canadians, and you mustn't do that. This was a reaction to preceding history of abuses by the security service. So they had to clean up, trash any tapes. Well, there were crimes on the tapes, but they didn't have Punjabi translators. Now, I know that's a very simple explanation, but it's depressing, but I believe it's true.
Wow, that's staggering levels of incompetence, actually. And what can one say? But we think of the families of those who died on board that aircraft. You spoke of the abusive marriage between Pakistan and the Khalistani projects. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I don't think the Khalistan project, we've already said, I think that it's not over. The diehard Khalistanis are still at it. They're still there. But I don't think they would be if it weren't for Pakistan. Because, I mean, Indians probably take this for granted, but you have to remember, there isn't anywhere else that is right next door to Punjab where you can scot-free have weapons training, safe haven if you're a wanted international terrorist, where you can slip across the border. I mean, that happened for years. Without Pakistan, I don't think they would have survived. And from Pakistan's point of view, it's a pretty good deal because very cheaply, they have the Khalistanis ready to go and make trouble in India, its arch enemy. And all they have to do is just tolerate them, subsidize them, organize them a little bit using the ISI, and exploit them for their own strategic purposes, because, of course, they wanted, ever since the disastrous, humiliating defeat by India in the 1971 war, which turned East Pakistan into Bangladesh, they wanted to get back at India. They wanted a buffer state between Pakistan and India. They wanted to cut off India's land access to Kashmir. They had all kinds of great strategic reasons, so they thought, for allowing and promoting the Khalistani movement to profit. So Pakistan is absolutely key to this, and I don't think that's going to change.
But why an abusive marriage? Why do you call it an abusive marriage? Pakistan's patronage of terror groups, yes, but why an abusive marriage?
Because Khalistanis pledge allegiance to Pakistan. Sikhs for Justice, for example, Gurpatwant Singh Pannoon, who wants a referendum on Sikh sovereignty, actually wrote to Prime Minister Imran Khan saying all the Khalistanis are going to ride to the defense of Pakistan in any attack by India. We're going to fight against our country for Pakistan. And he's doing that at a time when Sikhs in Pakistan are being driven out by these kidnappings of girls, forced conversions, attacks on Gurdwaras. I mean, the Sikh population of Pakistan hasn't dropped from 2 million before partition to a few thousand and dropping now for no reason. It's because of the abuse of all religious minorities in Pakistan. That's what I mean by an abusive marriage. They would take that punishment, accept all of that punishment for the Sikhs, and then pledge allegiance to Pakistan. That's an abusive marriage.
Absolutely, I see that. Why has there not been more of a backlash among Canadian citizens against the state's patronage of these terror groups? Why has Canada or sections of Canada provided? This is of course the photograph that you were talking about. But why has this kind of patronage been accepted by the ordinary Canadian citizen?
Because it doesn't affect them. They're busy with their families, the same as most of the Sikh community, and they look around and they see the Sikhs on their street are great people. They help them out if they need a hand, and they're good citizens. Generally speaking, they're professionals, and they're welcome in Canada. It's just that the small minority that we spoke of a moment ago, they have their own little power centers, very concentrated. Most Canadians don't see them. Most Canadians, they don't have to think about all of this.
Yeah. Finally, in the writing of this book, because I know that you have been like a good dogged journalist, been, literally snapping at the heels of this story and this investigation for years. But in the writing of this book, what is the one thing you discovered that really surprised you that you had absolutely no idea of?
I think what it surprised and depressed me to discover how utterly responsible, well, you say we're dogged, not dogged enough, I'm afraid, how utterly the media had failed to convey the seriousness of the threat and the complete incompetence with which we confronted it. I mean, when I got really dug into the trial record, very boring stuff, by the way. I mean, I sat through it and I nodded off half the time when they get into these arcane legal arguments. Guess what? That was the key to the case. I totally missed it. So did we all. We all nodded off. And those legal arguments led to absolutely crucial evidence, damning evidence, being thrown out and ruled inadmissible. That's why the trial failed. And we missed that story. We missed it completely. That surprised me to see. I completely failed in my job. We all did.
Well, that's candid, but then you did go and write this superbly researched book, and I urge everybody to read it. I was going to say, if you are interested in the history of how the Khalistan separatist and terrorist movement was born, but Terry Milewski has reminded us that this is not a thing of the past. Blood for Blood is out now. Terry Milewski, on the anniversary of the Kanishka air bombing aboard Air India, the 9/11 before 9/11 did not get the attention attention it should have, and the victims of those families did not get the justice that they should have in the way that they should have. Terry, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and congratulations on your book and for not nodding off in the research that led to it. Thank you very much, and a pleasure to have you on.
I enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.